So let's look at some of the foundations of CSR, some of the turning points and some of the key moments in history. One company to be very aware of course, is the East India Company. That lasted 274 years and really was how the empire was outsourced and expanded by the British government, with the company running its own army, its shares owned and passed among the elite, and the company really tasked with expanding British influence and making large amounts of money for wealthy people and the elite of Britain. Of course, ethically, the East India Company was known perhaps for being somewhat less ethical than it might have done, partially blamed, of course, for opium into China, for the Indian Mutiny, which saw the eventual demise of the East India Company, and of causing war and conflict in the name of commerce. Eventually it was shut down after major governance and corruption scandals, partly due to the Indian Mutiny, but also of the mid-19th century, but also due to general discomfort about the power and influence of the business itself. Of course, this did not enhance the reputation of the joint stock limited liability company. Another key moment in the history of corporate governance and corporate responsibility is the incident surrounding the South Sea bubble, the South Sea Company, which went spectacularly bust in 1720. And of course, Isaac Newton, the brainiest man in Britain, lost £20,000 in value in shares in the South Sea Company. And if you imagine how much money that was in 1720, it must be worth millions today. So the South Sea bubble really helped again set back the onset of what we now call the joint stock limited liability company. It wasn't the only spectacular share bust of the time. The Dutch tulip scandal, the Mississippi Company, which nearly bankrupted the French state after the end of the 100 Years' War, were also key moments in early stock market or early stock trading, which resulted in major governance scandals. Moving forward to the 18th century, towards the end of that century, we saw the first beginnings of discomfort with slavery in Britain and the first blood sugar boycotts of West Indian sugar, where the middle classes of Britain began to be very concerned about the ethics of how sugar was being produced in the West Indies, and the term blood sugar to do with slavery became known. And of course, this movement eventually resulted in the death of slavery in the UK and later in America and around the rest of the world. And you might credit some of its early beginnings with ethical activists who were concerned about the companies importing sugar into the UK. So that's an early sign of activists having a major influence on key moments in history. And during the 19th century, we saw the rise of Victorian morality. We saw in the early part the empire, the business empire of Sir Titus Salt in the north of England, where he created a town around his factory which became known as Saltaire, and pioneered better conditions for workers, better living and working conditions. And that was taken up by the great Quaker families of Victorian Britain, the Cadburys based in Birmingham, who ran their Bourneville factory and improved conditions for the Bourneville workers. And then the Lever brothers, who partly founded today's leading company Unilever, ran an operation in Port Sunlight in the northwest of England, where they too helped pioneer better practices. And of course we mustn't forget Sir Robert Owen, the famous Quaker, who is said to have pioneered the term human capital and really looked at how to treat people better and get more productivity and be more moral as a result during that period. Moving forward to the early 20th century and the end of the 19th century, a famous journalist, at least in the history of journalism, named Ida Tarbell, brought down the Rockefeller oil empire and saw the end of the trusts and cartels which had stitched up modern America at that time. And her book really helped change the way regulators, markets and individuals and citizens looked at business ethics and the control that large companies exerted over the economy. We also saw in that period, the early 20th century, a book written by Upton Sinclair, the crusading journalist, who later wrote a book called Oil, on which the movie There Will Be Blood is based. Upton Sinclair wrote a book called The Jungle at the time, published in 1906, which really highlighted the terrible working conditions of some of the Chicago meatpacking factories and the workers and the conditions that they laboured under. And that led partly to the first, what we might call, modern health and safety legislation. Of course, there had been rules before, but it is said that if we look back and we look at our modern legislation, particularly in the US, we can see that many of it came from some of the campaigns led by individuals such as Upton Sinclair. Moving forward, after and before World War I, there were of course major debates about business ethics. Henry Ford and his work, pioneering work in some ways, will be covered in more detail as a case study later. But we can also see that the 1929 Wall Street crash had a major impact on how business ethics was viewed, and of course a major debate took place in the 1930s about shareholder versus stakeholder capitalism. And that sort of movement dated really from that period of around 1916, 1920 onwards into the 30s, and of course during the 1940s, as readers of history will remember, a lot of the world was distracted by World War II.